Well, good morning, Westside. It's really exciting to be here, really exciting to be with you guys on Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all of the moms. Mom, if this is the service that you're watching online, love you, happy Mother's Day. I want to jump right in today because I want to cover a lot of ground in a very, very short amount of time. I want to share a little bit of my story with you today, and I'm going to cover several years, and so I'm going to give you just like some cliff notes of some different events because I want to show you how God worked some different events through my life for his good and for his purpose. And so jump back to when I was in eighth grade. When I was in eighth grade, my dad took us out to a fancy dinner at the Cracker Barrel. And so we went to dinner. Yeah, right. Well, some people are a little too excited about that. So we went to dinner at Cracker Barrel, and my dad shared with us how he felt like him and my mom were being called to plant a church in Cape Coral, Florida. And my dad worked at a church in Fort Myers, Florida, and we went to school in Fort Myers, but he wanted us to be all in where we lived in Cape Coral, Florida. And so we planted a church when I was an eighth grader, and how that impacted me most as an eighth grader, your biggest decision in eighth grade is where you're gonna go to high school next year. And so we decided that we were gonna be all in for Cape Coral. And so I went to Mariner High, which is actually the school where our church started meeting at. And because of that, I got to go to a really great high school. Now I want to let you know that it was not the closest high school to my house. It was not the wealthiest high school I could have chosen, but it was definitely the right high school for me to end up at, and I'm really glad I went to Mariner High. Fast forward, freshman year, I played freshman football, I played freshman basketball, and partway through my freshman basketball season, I noticed a bump on the bottom of my foot. And so I went and they did a procedure, they took it off, they sent it away for some testing. We thought that's the end of that story. Fast forward another month or so, and I'm sitting in an oncologist's office, and they're telling me that I'm being diagnosed with a cancer called Ewing sarcoma. And I went through 9 months of chemo, and I went from being an athlete, not necessarily a good athlete, but an athlete at my school, to being the bald, skinny, pale kid, chemo kid, walking around high school every single day. And it was around that time when I met one of the varsity assistant coaches on our football team. And I was a freshman, so I did not interact with the varsity coaches very much. And he came and found me one day and put his arm around me and slapped me in the chest and said, "Hey, you're my new assistant coach." And that was my first introduction with him. And I did everything with him from that point forward. If he was in the film room, he brought me with him and we cut film together. If he was out on the practice field setting up drills, he brought me and I helped him set up drills. If he was throwing footballs at wide receivers, he brought me to throw some footballs at wide receiver. And I really appreciated him so much. Fast forward a little bit further. After 9 months of chemo, I got the all clear that I could go back to slowly beginning to train and do some sports. In my junior year, I was able to play just a little bit of football, like not a ton, but kind of get my strength back. And then my senior year, I switched positions, and guess who my new position coach was? It was that coach that had found me in the hallway and told me that I was his new assistant. And that was my best year of sports, period, was my senior year of football. And I have so many good memories getting to play all 10 games, getting to play for that coach. I owe so much to him. Fast forward a little bit, and I told you we're gonna go through a lot of years in a short amount of time. I had graduated, I had left school, and I found out that coach was now attending my dad's church. And so if you can remember, we started this church in Cape Coral, which is why I went to Mariner, which is why I met this coach, and now that coach is attending that church. So fast forward one more time to just a few years ago, or a couple years ago, and I get a FaceTime call from my dad. And I quickly realized that it's my mom trying to figure out how to flip the camera. And when she flipped, Happy Mother's Day, Mom, I love you so much. Once she flipped the camera, it was of the baptistry at my dad's church. And this coach was getting baptized. And not just getting baptized, he turned around and then baptized his son. And now that I can step back out of this story, I could see how God was working this all together for his good, how God was working behind the scenes. And let me tell you, in the moment, there were some moments in that story where I was laying in a hospital bed. It did not feel like God was working all things for his glory, but stepping back We can see how God was working everything in his timing. And the theological term that we put on that is called God's providence. God is working behind the scenes when you step back and you can see his fingerprints all over the story. And we're gonna see that time and time again in our story today. In our story today, in honor of moms everywhere, we are talking about one of the most courageous characters in the Bible, period. And that's Esther. And we're gonna see God's providence in Esther's story time and time again. Now, Esther takes place about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. If you remember Daniel during the exile, Eddie talked about this a couple weeks ago. He didn't eat the food, they lived differently. And then we talked about Nehemiah, and Nehemiah had led the people back to their lands and they rebuilt the wall. Well, this story is after both of those stories, and the people of Israel have returned to their land, which might be a little bit confusing because this story doesn't take place in their land. This story takes place in the capital city of Persia, which is Susa. And so what has happened here is that the Israelites went back to the land, but not all of them. They were supposed to go back to the land. They should have returned to the land, but for whatever reason, even though it was God's will for them to return, some of the Jews did not return to their land. And so these are Jews that have not followed God's will for their life. So you could say that they are out of God's will at this point. And not just that, this is the only book of the Bible. This may be the craziest fact. This is the only book of the Bible where God's name is never mentioned. Not once. Not even as a pronoun. The word prayer doesn't even show up. There's no praying in this entire story. So God's not mentioned. These are Jews that have not followed the will of God. And to pile on one more thing, there's a lot of moral ambiguity in this story. There is sex and drunkenness and murder. Like, this is a story, if your kids were going to watch like the real life movie, you might be like, oh, we're gonna wait till you're a little bit older to watch this one. Like, there's a lot of that, and our heroes in the story take place in some of it. And so what this story is doing, it's saying despite this mess, despite the fact that they have not followed God's will for their life, despite the fact that God's never even mentioned in this story, that God is still good, and we can see God working. We can see God's providence in all of this story, him working all things for his good, and his fingerprints are all over this story. And so it really is an invitation to us. It's an invitation for us to look at the story and watch how God is working and wonder how God might be working in our stories right now. Whether we're on that high moment or we're in a low point, how might God be working in our story right now? So let's jump right in because I really want to cover this whole book in the next 20 minutes or so. So Esther kicks off with a giant party. And when I say party, this party lasts 180 days. And King Xerxes, the king of Persia, he throws this party to celebrate himself. Like he's like, I'm pretty great. We should party because I'm pretty great. And so he throws in a 180-day party. And after 180 days, he's like, that's not quite enough partying. Let's party for 7 more days. And so they party for 187 days because there ain't no party like a Persia party because a Persia party lasts 187 days. And so on a day 187, now keep in mind, the king has been drinking for 187 days. He gets a 187th day of drinking type idea, and he says, you know what? Let's bring my wife in to entertain me and all my friends. All the men are just like, I guess this isn't going good. So the queen, his wife, is throwing a simultaneous party during all of this, and she refuses to come. That makes the king furious, and so he just gets rid of her. Like, she is gone, she is no longer the queen. And after a little bit of time has passes, the king realizes, I kind of miss having a queen. We should do something about this. And this is where this story becomes like the show The Bachelor Persia edition. And so they start a nationwide search looking for the next queen. And so they try to find all of these beautiful women. They bring them into the king's harem. And then they get 12 months, an entire year of beauty treatments. They get 2 different 6-month sessions of beauty treatments. Who's like, yeah, I could go for a year at the spa. Like, that sounds good right about now. Some mom's hands and some dad's hands raised this morning. So they get an entire year of these beauty treatments. And this is where we meet our heroes. We meet Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai is a Jewish guy, and Esther is his cousin. But that's maybe not the best descriptor. You see, Esther was an orphan. Both of her parents had died. And so Mordecai adopts Esther, and he raises Esther as if she was his own daughter. And it's a really, really cool story. And so he raises Esther, and they enter the story right at the time of this beauty search, this Bachelor Persia edition, because Esther is beautiful. And so they bring her into the king's harem, and she gets her 12 months of beauty treatments. And after her 12 months of beauty treatment, she gets her one-on-one date with the king. And after that date, all scripture says is that she pleased the king more than anyone else. And so Esther becomes the queen of Persia. And so Esther, because of her beauty, is elevated to be the queen of Persia. Despite all of this, she conceals the fact that she's Jewish. Like, she doesn't tell anyone that she is Jewish. During this whole search and everything, Mordecai, her cousin, he's hanging around the king's gates. Like, they didn't have Twitter or anything, so he couldn't get updates on what was going. So he's hanging around the king's gates, trying to hear some updates about how Esther is doing. And so while he's hanging around, apparently he gets a job working at the king's gate at some point. And so one day, he's working a shift at the king's gate, and he hears a plot to kill the king. And so he's like, you know what, I should probably do something about this. And so he tells Esther, and they're able to foil the whole plot, and Mordecai is the hero. And if we could just stop the story right now, this is like a Disney story. Like, literally, Esther, like from rags to riches. Like, it's literally Cinderella, and Mordecai saves the day. The problem is, this is where our villain enters the story, Haman. Haman is one of the king's advisors. I've always pictured Haman as like an evil Jafar, and so from Aladdin. And so Haman enters the story right here, and Haman is pretty full of himself. Like, Haman thinks pretty highly of himself. He convinces the king, you know what would be a good idea is when I walk by, everyone has to bow. And so they pass this really horrible decree that when Haman walks by, everyone has to bow, and that's fine and all, until he walks by Mordecai one day, who refuses to bow. And this enrages Haman. And so he goes to the king and tricks him into a second decree where he says, you know what, that guy that won't bow down is Jewish, so let's just kill all the Jews. And so they issue this decree where they get to kill all the Jews, and the Jews can't defend themselves. This is obviously an issue because Mordecai and Esther, the heroes of our story, are Jewish, even though Esther has concealed her identity. And so Mordecai gets word to Esther saying, you are the queen. Like, you've got to do something about this. Like, you've got to do something to stop this. And Esther's first response is, no. Like, I don't know if you know how this works, Mordecai, but like, if I go in to see the king and he hasn't invited me in and he doesn't raise his scepter saying that he accepts me into his courts, he can just snap his fingers and I'm dead. And so her first response is like, nope, we've got to find another plan. Like, he could just kill me like that. And that's where we'll pick up in Esther chapter 4, verse 13. Mordecai writes this reply. He says this in verse 13. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. And this is such a great line. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this? And then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. And she says these brave words, if I must die, I must die. And so Mordecai delivers this really big challenge to Esther. He gives Esther some words that were probably hard to hear. Esther, her first response is with some fear. And she's like, no, I'm not going to see the king. He could kill me. And Mordecai challenges her on that. And he calls her up to something bigger. And he challenges her with the, maybe you have become queen for such a time as this. And Esther responds with remarkable courage. And I just want to stop right here and look at 3 lessons that we learn from Esther's courage. The first is this. Courage is not an initial response. Here's what I mean by that. Courage only exists where there is fear to overcome. Nelson Mandela said this about courage. He said, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers fear. And Esther's initial response is fear. Esther's very first response to all of this is that like the king could kill me. Like I am not going in there if I'm gonna die. And Mordecai challenges her on that, and she responds with courage. But courage does not exist where there is not fear to overcome. And so what we learn from this is that fear is a prerequisite for courage, not a disqualification. Fear is a prerequisite for courage. It does not disqualify us. The next thing that we learn is really something we need to ask ourselves is who's got your ear? Like, who are you listening to? We live in a society that has no shortage of opinions. Everywhere we turn, we are bombarded with opinions. News, social media, you name it. And not just that, we have never been more bombarded with agreeable opinions. And here's what I mean by that. I don't want to get too into the weeds on this. We could talk about this for a long time. But social media is a for-profit business. And social media is how a lot of us consume information. And what social media does is they are putting things on your feed that they think you will either like or will keep you engaged. And their entire business model is to try to keep you engaged, and they are selling your engagement to advertisements. And so they're gonna show you as many things that they think you will like. Back in the day, we all got newspapers, and we all read the same news every day. We'd open our newspaper. I remember being little, and I'd open the paper every day to see if the Reds had won, and they usually didn't, but I was hopeful. And so, I remember getting a newspaper. Now, can you imagine if everyone in the world was delivered a custom newspaper, and all the articles and everything was written to a way that would engage them or the way that they would like it? Because that's what happens with social media. And I say all that to say that more than ever, we need to be willing to have a Mordecai in our lives. We need to be willing to have someone in our lives who has permission to speak some hard words to us. They have permission to hold us accountable. They have permission to challenge us to do big things, to encourage and build us up to do big things. Esther couldn't have done all this if there wasn't some fear that she had to overcome, but she had a Mordecai. Who knows what happens in this story if there's not a Mordecai to challenge Esther, to call her up, to challenge her to do big things, but also to speak some hard words to her. And I really believe this. I believe with all my heart that each and every one of us is where we are at right now for such a time as this. But the one caveat I would put on that is that we are there for such a time as this to accomplish God's will and not our own. And so we better make sure that we've invited someone into our lives that can say some hard things to us that we may not want to hear. The third thing that we learn about Esther's courage is that Esther's courage was selfless. A shift for Esther is her stopping thinking about herself. Did you notice in Mordecai's reply to her how he reminds her that this is about all people, this is about all the Jews and not just you. And so when she becomes selfless, when she starts thinking about others, that's when she really becomes courageous. That's when God uses her to do something big. And isn't that just like God to do some of his best work and really do his best work when we are willing to be selfless, when we are willing to be less and point the glory to him? That's why John chapter 3 verse 30 says this: he must become greater and I must become less. Esther's selflessness really created her courage. And so let's jump right into that courageous act. So Esther, she enters the king's courts, she walks in, and the king is very pleased to see her. He raises his scepter, she's accepted in, and he says, Esther, what is your greatest desire? What is your deepest wish? And she does what I might do, and she just makes dinner plans. She says, I want you and Haman, why don't you guys come over for dinner tonight? And so they throw a big feast. Esther has a big feast thrown for them, and they're reclining and eating, and they get to the end of their meal. And the king says, Esther, what is it that you want? Like for a second time, like, what is your greatest desire? Up to half of my kingdom, I will give it to you. And Esther says, my deepest wish, my greatest desire is, and she kind of pauses. And she says, you'll come over for dinner tomorrow night. And now we don't know why she paused. We can speculate all day. It might have been strategic. A lot of commentaries say that there's some hesitation or some fear in the way she worded it. Maybe she's just not ready to ask the king yet, but she pauses there regardless. And I think there's some really cool lessons from that because God does a lot of work in that pause. In that moment where she pauses, God does some of the coolest things in this entire story. And so I want to ask you, because I know I've been there in my life, if you are now or if you've ever had a point in your life where you kind of felt like you were on pause, where you kind of felt like you were a little bit stuck. Like, will I ever get that promotion? Will that relationship issue ever resolve itself? Will I ever get out of this season of life? I feel spiritually stuck. Whatever it is, you can fill in the blank for you. And what I want to remind you of today, especially if you're in that moment right now, that God never wastes the pause and his timing is always perfect. And we're going to see here in a second how much God does in this pause in her story. We had a very minor pause in our family last Thanksgiving. We were getting ready to fly to go see my in-laws for Thanksgiving. And this is not an in-law joke because my in-laws are awesome. Happy Mother's Day to my mother-in-law. Like they really are. They spoil us. It's really fun to go visit them. And so we're getting ready to go see them. We're really excited. And my dog gets sick. Now, our dog never gets sick. But we had been hiking and he had swam in some water he shouldn't have been in. And he got really sick. And so we took him to the vet and it was pretty serious. Like if we hadn't caught it when he did it, it could have killed him. And so we were giving him meds hoping that he would improve. And we got to the time where we needed to leave and we had to make a call. And so I drove Manny to the airport and she flew ahead of me, spent time. And I'm sure she was really sad to leave me behind in Phoenix, or leave me behind here. And I was pretty bored because I would have rather been in Phoenix feasting and hanging out with my in-laws instead of watching a sick dog sleep. But after a couple of days, I got over myself a little bit and I decided, you know what? I already have the day off. This would be a great time for me to get up all of our Christmas lights. And so I spent the day hanging our Christmas lights around the house and made it a surprise. And it was a lot of fun hanging Christmas lights around our little house. Fast forward, I was actually able to go to Phoenix and join everyone for the last few days, and then we flew back together. And it was such a fun memory driving up to our house on the way back from the airport to see all of the Christmas lights on and get to surprise my wife from that. And now, I'm saying all that, I am so far from a perfect husband. I am such an imperfect husband, but I had so much joy despite the pause getting to bless my wife in a really cool way. Like there was so much joy in all of that for me. And I wonder how much more our good Father enjoys working in the pause in our life, in the moments where we're like, what is happening right now? In that moment in my story when I'm laying in a hospital bed being like, what are you doing through all this? That God has a plan and he's slowly pulling it together in his timing. We often want God's gifts and his time and his resources, but we don't often want to wait for his timing. And so just remember, especially if you're there today, God never wastes that pause. And look what he does in this story. So Mordecai leaves dinner that night and he's leaving, he's feeling pretty good. He just had dinner with the king and the queen, just the three of them. So he leaves feeling pretty good until he sees Mordecai. And once Haman sees Mordecai, he is furious. And so he goes home. And you know, misery loves company. And so he starts complaining to his family and his friends about Mordecai. And so how he spends his night that night, I don't know how you guys like to spend your evenings, but what Haman does is he builds a 75-foot tall pole that he is going to impale Mordecai on. It's one way to spend an evening. At the same time, the king is having trouble sleeping. He goes to bed that night, and they didn't have the golf channel yet, and so he couldn't just click on that and fall asleep. But he goes to bed that night, so he's like, what is the most boring thing they could read to me? And so they bring him the Chronicles, which is just the story of his own life, which is a little conceited, but that's not the point. And so they're reading him the Chronicles, and the story that they just happened to read him that night was the story of Mordecai. And it was the story of how Mordecai had saved his life, and the king became troubled, saying, did we ever do anything to celebrate this guy? And come to find out, they hadn't done anything to celebrate Mordecai. And so the king goes to work the next day, and Haman comes in, and he's like, Haman, say someone saved your life, and you forgot to celebrate them. This was a while ago. What would you do for them? And Haman is so full of himself at this moment that he thinks the king is talking about him. So he's like, all right, here's what I would do. I'd elevate them to second in command. I'd put them up on your horse. I'd put your royal robes around them, and I would lead them through the city saying, this is how the king honors someone. And the king thinks and goes, that's a pretty good idea. Why don't you go do that to Mordecai? And so Haman now has to lead this guy around the city who he hates, around the city declaring, this is how the king honors someone. And so Haman goes home that night, once again, to his friends and family. And this is the first of several ironic reversals. And he's telling his friends and family about what had happened. And his friends and family are kind of singing a little bit of a different tune. His friends and family at this point are like, maybe you shouldn't kill this guy. Like, if the king is honoring him, like, I don't know if it's such a good idea. And that is the first of so many ironic reversals in this story, as we'll see. Well, as he's complaining, some of the king's servants come and get Haman. They're like, hey, it's time for dinner part 2. And so they go to dinner part 2, and they have another great meal, and they're reclining afterwards. And the king is like, all right, Esther, like for a third time, what is your deepest wish? What is your greatest desire? I don't know if you're getting this sense from the king, but I don't know if you and your spouse have ever dealt with this. But when you're sitting in the car and you can't pick where you're going to eat, and you're like, just pick. Like, I will take you anywhere in central Illinois if we can pick a restaurant together. Like, price doesn't matter if we could just pick a restaurant. Nope, just me? All right. So the king here is like, Esther, what is your deepest wish? What is your greatest desire? Up to half my kingdom I will give you. And all Esther says is, if I have found favor with the king, would you spare my life? And would you spare the life of my people? And the king is furious. He's like, who's coming after my queen? Like, that is not cool. He is furious. And Esther simply says, this wicked man, Haman. And so the king leaves the room in a rage, like he is hot. And so while he's gone, Haman throws himself on Esther's lap, begging for his life. And so the king comes back in the room. He's already hot. He sees Haman laying on his wife, and he gets an idea that something else has happened. He actually says in scripture, who is this man that he would assault my wife while I'm in the house? And so he's even more mad. And some of the servants that were nearby are like, you know, he actually just built a 75-foot pole in his yard to impale Mordecai on. And the king's like, that'll do. And so Haman is impaled on the pole that he built for Mordecai. And it's just another ironic reversal. It's another example of God's providence, of God working out all these details. Now there's still there's still the problem of the decree, because once the king makes a decree, they can't just get rid of it. And so what they do is the king says, you know what, Mordecai's second in command now. So since you're second in command, why don't you write the decree? And so Mordecai, who in the pause was elevated to second in command, now he is the one, him and Esther together, to write the decree to save their people. And so the first decree said they could go after all the Jews, and the Jews cannot defend themselves. So they write a second decree that says the Jews not only can defend themselves, but if they've successfully killed their attacker, they can then go after their families. And so if you're wanting to go after them and really nothing bad can happen to you, that's one thing. But if you're wanting to go after them now, and they not only can defend themselves and kill you, but if they're successful, they can go after your wife and kids. Like, you are thinking twice about that. And so the Jews won a decisive victory that day. And they create a festival to remember it. And the scripture actually tells us that there were non-Jews that converted to be Jews because of like how much protection they had and how good their God is. And so we've really tackled two things today. We've talked about God's providence. We've talked about how God is working behind the scenes. He's the puppet master. And we've also talked about Esther's courage. And I don't think there could be a stronger correlation between the two, because when you know who's in control, you live a little differently. When you know God is working and God is working behind the scenes, you can live your life in just a different way. I went to college for a couple of years in Knoxville, Tennessee. And so I got pretty comfortable driving some mountain roads and some roads where you go up and there's a pretty big drop off beside the road. And I was pretty comfortable with that. One caveat, I was so nervous if it was raining. If it was raining and those roads were slick at all, like hands are at 10 and 2, like I'm focused on everything, I'm nervous and alert. But I also have a memory of several years ago. My parents rented a cabin in the Smoky Mountains, and so I flew out and joined them. And one night we went to dinner, and while we were at dinner, it started pouring down rain, and we piled back in the car, and my dad was driving, and I sat in the passenger seat, and I just fell asleep. And I slept the entire ride like a baby. Here's why. I was in the passenger seat, and my dad was driving, and I trusted my dad, and I knew my dad was gonna take care of me. And so I slept like a baby, because when we know who's in control, it enables us to live a courageous life on an entirely different level. And when we realize that God's working all these things for our good, we realize what Romans 8:28 says when he says, and we know that all things work for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. It lets us live a different kind of life. And so Westside, go live courageous lives this week because you know who's in control.